For those who have lived long enough to witness powerful men rise from nothing, dominate entire industries, and then slowly unravel under the weight of their own choices, this moment between Diddy and Netflix doesn't feel like a shock at all. It feels like a chapter history has written many times before, just with newer technology and a bigger spotlight. When Diddy dropped that billion-dollar lawsuit, it wasn't the move of a man standing firmly in his truth. It was the reflex of someone who has spent decades being protected by money, influence, and silence, and suddenly realized that none of those shields work the way they used to. Netflix didn't respond with fear, didn't scramble for damage control, didn't issue a soft apology or retreat behind closed doors, because real power doesn't raise its voice. It stands still and lets the record speak. And that's what made their response so loud without ever sounding aggressive. They understood something Diddy seems to be struggling with. This isn't the early 2000s anymore, when narratives could be massaged, stories buried, and uncomfortable truths quietly swept aside. This is the streaming era, the archival era, the era where footage doesn't disappear, witnesses don't stay silent forever, and documentation lives longer than reputation. Netflix didn't create the allegations that now surround Diddy's name. Those allegations existed long before cameras ever rolled, long before a documentary was ever pitched, long before a single episode aired. What Netflix did was something deeply uncomfortable for anyone used to controlling their image. They organized the past, laid it out clearly, and allowed the public to see patterns instead of isolated incidents. For an older audience especially, that distinction matters, because life teaches you that isolated mistakes look different from repeated behavior, and patterns tell stories that excuses never can. Diddy's lawsuit tried to frame the documentary as an act of betrayal, as if Netflix had gone rogue and invented a narrative designed to destroy him. But Netflix calmly reminded the world that history doesn't belong to the person who lived it. It belongs to everyone affected by it. Their response essentially said, without saying it directly, that truth doesn't need permission and documentation doesn't require approval from the subject. There's something deeply sobering about watching a man who once commanded boardrooms now attempt to command silence, because silence is often the final strategy of those who realize their control is slipping. To viewers who've lived through the fall of politicians, the disgrace of once respected public figures, and the slow erosion of institutions that once seemed untouchable, this lawsuit doesn't read as strength, it reads as panic. Netflix's refusal to blink sent a message that landed especially hard for those who understand legacy. You don't get to declare yourself misunderstood when the evidence has already been cataloged. What Diddy called defamation, Netflix reframed as documentation, reminding the court and the public that they relied on interviews, sworn testimony, public records, existing footage, and first-hand accounts that predated their involvement by years. They didn't argue emotion, they argued timeline, and timelines don't care about ego. There's a quiet dignity in the way Netflix responded, not because they're morally superior, but because they understand the rules of this era. The truth doesn't need dramatics, it only needs consistency. For people over 65, this moment resonates differently because it mirrors lessons learned the hard way. That no amount of success excuses harm, that no legacy is immune to scrutiny, and that time eventually removes protection from everyone. Diddy's lawsuit felt less like a pursuit of justice and more like grief. Grief over a public image that can no longer be maintained, grief over control that has slipped away, grief over realizing that the story will continue whether he approves of it or not. Netflix didn't insult him, didn't mock him, didn't play into the theatrics. They simply stood by the work, by the sources, by the process, and in doing so they made something painfully clear. This wasn't personal, it was historical. And history has a way of hardening once it's written down. For those who understand how power once operated, this moment is a reminder that influence without accountability eventually collapses under its own weight. Diddy didn't sue the accusers, didn't sue the individuals who spoke, didn't sue the countless platforms where these stories circulated for years. He sued the company that packaged the truth too neatly for him to escape it. That alone speaks volumes to anyone who has lived long enough to recognize deflection when they see it. Netflix's calm response carried an unspoken truth that older generations understand deeply. When someone spends more energy attacking the messenger than confronting the message has already won. This wasn't a battle over facts, it was a battle over control, and Netflix made it clear that control left the building a long time ago. What makes this moment heavy isn't the lawsuit itself, but what it represents, the end of an era where power could dictate memory. Netflix stood firm not because they enjoy controversy, but because retreat would imply doubt. And doubt is the one thing they didn't have. They trusted their process, their legal vetting, their documentation, and their understanding of the public's right to see a complete record. For an audience that values truth over spectacle, this moment lands like a reckoning rather than entertainment. It's the sound of a door closing on a version of celebrity that once relied on fear, favors, and silence. Diddy may have believed that money could still bend perception, but Netflix's response proved that perception now bends toward evidence. And that's what makes this chapter so final feeling. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy with consequence. This isn't about a documentary anymore. It's about a man discovering that time has removed his armor, and a platform confident enough to let history stand exactly as it is, unedited, unsympathetic, and impossible to unsee. What makes Netflix's response truly dangerous for Diddy isn't just the words filed in court, it's the quiet confidence behind them, the kind that comes from knowing there is more evidence than what has already been shown and more history than what has already been discussed. And for anyone who has lived long enough to understand how institutions operate, that silence speaks louder than any public statement ever could. Netflix didn't just defend what aired, they subtly reminded the world that documentaries are always edited down, that hours of interviews become minutes, that mountains of material never make it to the screen, and that what the public sees is often the mildest version of the full record. For an older audience especially, that realization carries weight, because life teaches you that restraint is often more telling than excess, and when a company known for protecting itself chooses not to reveal everything at once, it's rarely because they lack material. Behind closed doors, Netflix operates with teams of lawyers, archivists, compliance officers, and risk analysts whose sole job is to ensure that what goes public can survive scrutiny years later, not just weeks of headlines. This isn't a scrappy media outlet throwing accusations into the wind. This is a corporation that prepares for lawsuits before cameras even start rolling, and that preparation shows in the way they responded, measured, deliberate, and almost patient. To those who've watched public figures unravel, there's something chilling about that patience, because it suggests Netflix isn't rushing to win the argument, they're prepared to win the record. When Diddy escalated with a billion-dollar threat, Netflix didn't retreat. Instead, they stood firm, fully aware that escalation in court often means expansion of evidence, discovery processes, depositions, and the legal ability to introduce additional materials that were previously kept private. For someone with a long memory of how legal battles work, this is where the danger becomes obvious. Lawsuits don't silence information, they unlock it. Netflix knows this, and by welcoming the fight rather than avoiding it, they signaled that they are comfortable with whatever comes out next. That kind of confidence isn't bravado, it's preparation. Diddy may have believed that legal pressure would force Netflix to pull back, but history tells us that powerful institutions rarely crumble under threats. They consolidate, fortify, and respond with overwhelming documentation. What Netflix effectively communicated, without ever saying it outright, is that if pushed, they are legally empowered to show more, not less, and that should give pause to anyone who understands how discovery works. For an older audience that has seen scandals unfold in slow motion, this moment feels less like a confrontation and more like a trap closing. The lawsuit didn't corner Netflix. It cornered Diddy into a process where control becomes impossible. Every email, every recorded interview, every internal memo tied to public allegations becomes fair game, and Netflix's legal teams are trained to weaponize process, not panic. This is why their response feels so cold. They aren't fighting emotionally, they're fighting structurally. Netflix also understands something deeply important about public perception, something older generations have learned through decades of watching media cycles evolve. Credibility is built by consistency, not defensiveness. By standing by their documentary without theatrics, Netflix reinforced the idea that they had nothing to hide, while Diddy's aggressive posture only amplified the sense that he does. For viewers who value restraint and clarity, the contrast couldn't be sharper. One side stood still, the other lunged, and history rarely favors the lunge. There's also a deeper cultural shift at play that resonates strongly with those who have watched industries transform. Platforms no longer exist to protect stars, they exist to serve audiences, and audiences now demand transparency over loyalty. Netflix knows its survival doesn't depend on shielding powerful individuals, it depends on maintaining trust with viewers who expect honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. Diddy's lawsuit misread that shift completely. treating Netflix like an old-school gatekeeper rather than a modern distributor accountable to millions of subscribers. And in doing so, he revealed how out of step he is with the world he once dominated. For people who've lived long enough to recognize when someone is fighting yesterday's battles, this lawsuit feels tragically outdated, a move rooted in an era when influence could still buy silence. Netflix's response made it clear that era is over. They're not afraid of controversy because controversy doesn't erode their power. Inconsistency does, and they showed none. Every word of their response reinforced the same message. We followed procedure, we verified sources, we relied on public record, and we stand by the outcome. For an audience that respects due process and documentation, that message carries authority. The danger for Diddy is that authority compounds over time. The longer Netflix stands firm, the weaker his position appears. This isn't just a legal standoff, it's a generational shift in how accountability works. Netflix represents an institutional memory that doesn't age, doesn't forget, and doesn't bend to nostalgia. Diddy, on the other hand, is fighting to preserve a version of himself that time has already moved past. That's what makes this moment feel so final. Not because of what's been revealed, but because of what might be revealed next. And because Netflix has made it clear they are fully prepared for that moment. To anyone who understands how history actually unfolds, this isn't escalation for drama's sake, it's inevitability. And once inevitability takes hold, there's no negotiating with it, only enduring it. What many people don't fully grasp yet, but those who've lived long enough can feel in their bones, is that this lawsuit isn't just about Diddy and Netflix. It's about power shifting quietly in rooms most of us never see, and once that shift happens, it never fully swings back. While the public argues online and headlines cycle in and out, executives, attorneys, and industry veterans are watching this unfold with a different kind of attention because they understand that moments like this redraw the rules without ever announcing it. Netflix standing firm doesn't just protect one documentary, it sends a message across Hollywood that the old system of intimidation no longer works the way it once did. For decades, certain names carried weight so heavy that people whispered instead of spoke, avoided instead of challenged, and calculated instead of questioned. But fear has a shelf life, and what we're watching now is fear expiring in real time. For an older audience that remembers when reputations were untouchable simply because they were powerful, this moment feels like a quiet revolution. Not loud, not celebratory, but deeply consequential. Streaming platforms talk to each other, legal teams compare notes, and studios pay attention when one of the biggest players refuses to bend. Because if Netflix can withstand this pressure, it lowers the risk for everyone else. Diddy's lawsuit, intended to scare, instead functioned like a green light in the Hollywood signaling to other platforms that the legal ground is solid, the public appetite is strong, and the era of deference is over. That's the kind of outcome no amount of money can reverse. It's a storm. For those who understand how industries protect themselves, this is where the damage compounds. Once one platform proves it can survive the storm, others follow, not out of malice, but out of precedent. Netflix didn't just defend itself, it demonstrated a model. Document carefully, verify relentlessly, and stand by the work. That model is now available to every other streaming service watching from the sidelines. For Diddy, this represents a loss far greater than any court ruling could impose, because it strips away the invisible shield that once made people hesitate. And hesitation is power's best friend. Without it, everything changes. To those who've lived through cultural shifts, this feels familiar. Maxwell, the moment when people stop asking permission and start telling the truth plainly. The industry doesn't need to like Netflix's documentary to respect what it represents. Proof that legacy doesn't override accountability. What makes this especially heavy for older viewers is the understanding that reputation isn't just what you've built, and then it's what survives scrutiny. And scrutiny has finally arrived without fear. The lawsuit didn't isolate Netflix, it isolated Diddy, marking him as the variable others no longer feel obligated to protect. As that's a lonely position for someone who once sat at the center of influence. For decades, alliances formed around power, not principle, but this moment signals a recalibration. Principle is back in fashion, not because people suddenly became moral, but because protecting the indefensible carries too much risk. Netflix's firmness gives cover to everyone else who might have hesitated.
It's not about politics.
And once cover exists,
It's about patterns.
truth spreads faster.
It's about the way the rich
This is
and
how
powerful
narratives
use
collapse,
silence as a
not with a
shield.
bang, but with a
Epstein's
collective
world was built
decision
on
to stop
manipulation,
pretending.
on
For an
keeping people
audience that has
close
seen
and using
institutions
secrets
shift
as
over
control.
time,
And that's
this
what makes
lawsuit
these
feels
leaked
less like a
emails so
battle
terrifying.
and more like a
Not
turning
just the
point.
names,
The
but
moment when the
patterns they
industry
reveal.
quietly agrees
Behind
that the
every
cost of
redacted
silence
name
is
is a real
higher than the
person.
cost of honesty.
A story that never
Diddy's
got to be
attempt to
told.
assert
The
dominance
more
through
you read,
litigation
the more
instead
you
revealed
realize
how
how
little
deep this all
leverage he has
runs.
left.
The
Because
victims,
leverage
the
depends on
cover-ups, the
fear,
institutions
and
that
fear
looked
depends
away.
on
It's
uncertainty.
heartbreaking.
Netflix
And it makes
removed
you wonder,
uncertainty by
if this
standing
is what's
still.
being released
They didn't
now, what's still
negotiate
being
publicly,
hidden?
didn't
The
hedge,
question
didn't signal
everyone's asking
weakness.
is,
They
why
affirmed
now?
their confidence
Why are
and
these
let the
documents
implications
coming out at
ripple
this exact
outward.
moment?
And ripple they
Maybe
did.
it's coincidence.
Executives now
Maybe
know
it's
that standing up to Diddy
Maybe
doesn't
it's
invite
time.
destruction.
Because you can
it
only
invites
bury
clarity.
truth for so long
That
before it
realization
digs its way
spreads
out.
fast in professional
The UK is
circles.
already buzzing
For
again.
older viewers who
Prince
understand
Andrew's
how
lost his
power
royal
erodes
titles.
not through attack,
The British media
but
is
through
running the
exposure.
story nonstop.
This is the most
And
telling
even
part
Sarah
of the story.
Ferguson's name is
The
back in the
lawsuit
mix.
didn't restore
And now
authority,
America's
it confirmed
starting to
its
feel it
absence.
too.
The
timing
Diddy may
couldn't
still
be
have
more
resources,
electric.
but
And while this
resources
storm
without
of secrets
influence are just
explodes,
assets
another
waiting to
one
be
is
depleted.
quietly unfolding
Influence
behind
comes
prison
from
walls.
credibility,
And it
and
involves
credibility
Diddy.
doesn't
The
survive
same
when
Diddy who once
institutions
ruled the
stop
charts,
shielding
the
you.
parties, the red
Netflix
carpet.
didn't just defend a
The same man
documentary,
who was
they
once
helped puncture the
untouchable.
myth of
Now,
untouchability,
sitting in a federal
and
cell,
myths,
staring at
once
four
punctured,
walls,
never fully
realizing
reinflate.
that fame doesn't
This
buy
moment will be
forgiveness.
remembered not
Let's
for the
get to
lawsuit
it.
itself,
The news broke
but for
this
what
week, and
followed.
it's bad.
The
Maybe
silence
worst
from
yet for
former
him.
allies, the
Diddy's
shifting
official
posture of
prison release
studios,
date
the
has been
quiet
pushed back.
recalculations happening
Originally
behind
set for May
closed doors.
2028.
For those who've
It's
watched
now
legends
June
fall before,
2028.
this feels
Just 1
achingly
month, right?
familiar.
But inside those
The moment
walls,
when the
a
room
month
goes
can feel like
quiet,
forever.
not out of respect,
Imagine you're counting
but
the
because
days to
everyone is
freedom,
taking mental
marking every
notes and
sunrise,
adjusting their
holding on to
distance.
hope.
That's when
And then
power
suddenly the
truly
calendar
fades,
changes.
not when people
That's
argue,
not just a
but when
date
they
being
stop
moved.
defending.
That's your
And
hope being
Netflix's
delayed.
stance
And it's
accelerated
not
that
random.
process in a way
According
Diddy
to
likely
reports,
never
this came
anticipated.
after Diddy was caught
This isn't about
violating
entertainment
BOP rules.
anymore, it's about
A few
authority
days ago,
draining away,
whispers
drop
started
by
spreading
drop,
that he was seen
until there's
drinking
nothing
alcohol.
left to leverage but
Something
memory.
absolutely
And
forbidden
memory,
in this
when
situation.
documented, belongs
Diddy
to
came out
everyone.
fast to deny it.
What many people
But then
don't fully
TMZ
grasp
doubled
yet,
down
but those
and
who've
said the
lived long
reports were
enough can
accurate.
feel in their bones,
And now this,
is that this lawsuit isn't just about Diddy and Netflix.
Really did go wrong.
It's about
Politics
power
prison
shifting
doesn't
quietly
play
in
around.
rooms most of us
They don't
never
care
see.
about your celebrity,
And once that
your
shift
Grammys,
happens,
your
it
money.
never fully
Their
swings
message
back.
is clear.
While the public argues
Play with us
online
again,
and
and we'll give you
headlines
6
cycle
more
in and
months.
out,
Maybe a year.
executives,
And that's what
attorneys,
makes
and
this
industry
terrifying for
veterans are
Diddy.
watching this
Because he's
unfold
not
with a
just
different
facing
kind of
punishment,
attention,
he's facing
because they
a warning.
understand that moments
This
like
man
this
who once
redraw the
commanded
rules
stages,
without
who
ever
once made
announcing
millions bow
it.
to his
Netflix
rhythm,
standing firm
now has
doesn't
to
just
answer for
protect
something
one
as small,
documentary. Yet it
as
sends a
serious
message
as
across
alcohol in a
Hollywood
cell.
that the old
And it's
system
sad,
of
isn't it?
intimidation
The
no
same
longer
arrogance
works the
that
way
made
it once
him
did.
unstoppable in
For
music
decades,
is now
certain names
destroying him
carried
in
weight
prison.
so heavy that
Because in
people
there,
whispered
there's
instead
no
of spoke,
entourage.
avoided
There's no
instead of
manager to
challenged,
spin the
and
story.
calculated instead
There's
of
just you,
questioned.
your choices,
But fear
and the
has a shelf
consequences.
life.
You can
And
tell
what
a
we're
lot
watching
about a
now is
person by
fear
how they act
expiring
when
in
no
real
one's
time.
watching.
For an
And
older
Diddy's
audience
still
that
acting like
remembers
the
when
world owes
reputations
him
were
control.
untouchable simply
That's why he
because they
keeps
were
breaking
powerful,
rules.
this
That's why he
moment
keeps
feels like a
denying
quiet
everything.
revolution.
That's why he
Not
still
loud,
thinks he's
not
bigger than the
celebratory,
system.
but deeply
But when the Bureau of
consequential.
Prisons changes
Streaming
your release
platforms
date,
talk to each other,
that's not gossip.
legal teams compare
That's not
notes,
rumor.
and studios
That's a
pay
fact written
attention
in
when
ink.
one of the biggest
Sources
players
from
refuses
Page
to
6
bend.
confirmed it.
Because
They
if
said the new
Netflix
date
can
is
withstand
June
this pressure,
2028.
it lowers
And they
the
also
risk for
shared that
everyone
Diddy's
else.
struggling to adjust
Diddy's
to prison
lawsuit,
life.
intended to
His
scare,
spokesperson
instead
tried to
functioned
soften
like a
it,
green
saying
light,
he's focused
signaling
on
to other
rehabilitation,
platforms that the legal
that he's
ground
trying
is
to grow,
solid, that the
people are
public appetite
exaggerating.
is strong.
But come on,
and the era of
if
deference
everything
is
was a
over.
lie, why the
That's the
punishment?
kind of outcome
Why the
no amount
extra
of money
month?
can reverse.
Why the restrictions?
For those who
It's not just
understand
the
how
alcohol
industries
either.
protect themselves,
There are reports
this is where
that
the
Diddy was
damage
caught making
compounds.
unauthorized three-way
Once one
phone calls,
platform proves it can
talking to people
survive
he
the
shouldn't.
storm,
He
others
tried to say
follow,
it was for
not out
PR,
of
for
malice, but out
interviews,
of
for
precedent.
managing his brand.
Netflix didn't just
But the
defend
prison isn't
itself,
buying
it demonstrated
They
a
know the
model.
game.
They've document carefully, verify relentlessly, and stand by the work. Even behind that model is now available to every other streaming service watching from the sidelines. Phone calls, visits, for Diddy, this represents a loss far greater than any court ruling could impose, and now because it strips away the invisible shield that once made people hesitate. And hesitation is power's best friend. One mistake without it, everything changes. Each one making to those who've lived through cultural shifts, this feels familiar. Still see the moment when people stop asking permission and start telling the truth plainly. He thought he could charm the industry doesn't need to like Netflix's documentary to respect what it represents. Doesn't move people now. Proof that legacy doesn't override accountability. What makes this especially heavy for older viewers is the understanding that reputation isn't just what you've built, it's what survives scrutiny, and scrutiny has finally arrived without fear. The lawsuit didn't isolate Netflix, it isolated Diddy,
right now he's
marking
digging
him as
himself
the
deeper.
variable
He
others
was
no
once
longer
living in
feel
luxury,
obligated to
surrounded
protect.
by yes men,
That's a
women,
lonely
and walls
position
of
for
fame.
someone who once
Now
sat
he's
at
in
the
a
center of
space where
influence.
none of that matters.
For
Where
decades,
respect
alliances
comes
formed
from
around
humility,
power, not principle.
And maybe
But
that's
this
what
moment
scares him
signals a
most.
recalibration.
Because to survive
Principle
there,
is
he has
back
to
in
be
fashion.
ordinary.
Not
And
because
Diddy
people
doesn't do
suddenly
ordinary.
became moral,
But this new
but because
punishment is a
protecting the
message.
indefensible carries
system
too
is
much
saying,
risk. You can't
charm
Netflix's
us.
firmness
You
gives
can't
cover to
control us.
everyone else who
You
might
can't
have
talk your way out of
hesitated.
time.
And once
And
cover
maybe,
exists,
just maybe,
truth
this is
spreads
what he
faster.
needs.
This is how
reality
narratives
check that even
collapse,
fame
not
can't
with a
buy
bang,
freedom from
but with a
consequences.
collective decision to
What's
stop
eerie, though,
pretending. Is how
all
for an
of this
audience that
connects
has
to what's
seen
happening with the
institutions
Epstein
shift over
leaks.
time.
These are
This
different
lawsuit
worlds.
feels less like a
One built
battle
on politics,
and more like a
one on
turning point.
entertainment.
But the
Both
moment
show
when
the
the
same
industry
pattern.
quietly
The
agrees
abuse
that
of
the
power.
cost of silence
The
is
silence.
higher than the cost
The
of
belief
honesty.
that wealth equals
Diddy's
immunity.
attempt to assert
And in both
dominance through
stories, that
litigation
illusion
instead
is
revealed
finally
how little
cracking.
leverage he has
Epstein
left,
thought he could
because
outsmart
leverage
everyone.
depends on fear,
Diddy thought the same.
and fear
But you
depends on
can't outsmart
uncertainty.
justice forever.
Netflix removed
It's like time
uncertainty
has a
by
way of
standing
evening the
still.
scales,
They didn't
no matter how
negotiate
long it
publicly,
takes.
didn't hedge,
I
didn't
can't even
signal
imagine
weakness.
how Diddy feels
They
right
affirmed
now,
their confidence
sitting in that
and let the
cell,
implications
realizing
ripple
that one
outward.
extra month is
And
now
ripple they did.
guaranteed,
Executives
knowing that it
now
could get
know that
worse.
standing up to
He's
Diddy
angry, no
doesn't
doubt.
invite destruction,
Angry at the
it invites
reports,
clarity.
angry at himself,
That realization
angry at a
spreads
system
fast in
that's finally
professional
holding him
circles.
accountable.
For older
But
viewers
anger
who
doesn't
understand
change
how
anything.
power
It
erodes
only
not
fuels
through
distraction.
attack, but
And
through
if he keeps
exposure,
walking this path,
this is the most
it's not
telling
going
part
to
of the
stop in a
story.
month.
The lawsuit
something
didn't restore
symbolic about all
authority,
of this.
it confirmed its
About watching
absence.
the mighty fall,
Diddy may still
not
have
out of hate,
resources,
but out of truth.
resources without
It's like the
influence are
world
just
is
assets
rebalancing
waiting to
itself,
be depleted.
one exposed lie at a
Influence
time.
comes from credibility,
Epstein's
and
unsealed
credibility
emails to
doesn't
Diddy's
survive
delayed
when
release.
institutions
The
stop
message is loud
shielding
and
you.
clear.
Netflix didn't
The
just
days of
defend a
untouchable
documentary,
power are over.
they helped puncture the
We've
myth
seen
of
it again and
untouchability,
again. People
and
who
myths,
thought they could
once
hide behind
punctured,
fame,
never
money,
fully
or
reinflate.
influence.
This
But the
moment will be
truth always
remembered
finds
not
a
for the
crack to
lawsuit
crawl
itself,
through.
but
And
for
when
what
it does,
followed.
it doesn't whisper.
The silence
It
from
roars.
former allies,
Diddy once
the
said in
shifting
an
posture of
interview that he
studios,
believed he could
the
control
quiet
his
recalculations happening
Maybe he still
behind
believes
closed
that.
doors.
But right
For those
now,
who've
it looks
watched
like
legends
destiny
fall
is
before,
controlling
this
him.
feels achingly
The man who
familiar.
once controlled artists,
The moment when the
charts,
room
and
goes
crowds is now
quiet,
being
not
controlled
out of
by
respect,
rules, schedules,
but
and
because
laws.
everyone is taking
That's the
mental
cruel
notes
irony of
and
it all.
adjusting their distance.
And yet, part of me
That's when
wonders
power
if this could
truly
be a turning
fades,
point.
not when people
If he'll
argue,
finally
but when
face
they
himself
stop
without the
defending.
cameras,
And
without the
Netflix's
lights,
stance
without the
accelerated
noise.
that process
Because
in a way
silence,
Diddy
truth is
likely
loud.
never anticipated.
And maybe that's what he's
This
been
isn't about
avoiding his
entertainment
entire
anymore.
life.
It's about
Strange,
authority
family.
draining away,
When you strip
drop
away
by
the
drop,
glamour,
until
the
there's
parties,
nothing
and the
left to
headlines,
leverage but
what's left
memory.
is just a man,
And memory, when
one who's made
documented,
choices
belongs
that
to
caught up to
everyone.
him.